Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear participants, welcome to the second module of week 9. In the previous module, we have discussed how in its desire to express emotions and sensibilities, people have always tried to link the word with some type of images. In the prehistoric times and in the beginning of the civilizations, we find that different type of actions and activities were pursued for this combined expression. We have seen how from the days of cave drawings to theatres to spectacles, we have gradually grown to the development of technology in such a state that the projection of moving images became a possibility. By the time we come to the 19th century, the debates about the primacy of the image or the primacy of the word for the literate and the cultured people had already started. By the time we find that the 20th century is about to start, cinematography has already become a fully developed art, and therefore we find that its association with literature has to be discussed further in detail. In this module, we would discuss to what extent cinema and literature are independent and also interdependent. If we look at cinema, do we look at it only as a mass entertainment medium, or do we look at it as an art? When we look at it as an art, is it different from being an entertainment medium only? And if it is an art, how is it different from other mediums of expressions to which it bears a resemblance, particularly the theatre, to which it owes a lot of inspiration, and also to literature? Is it a tool of enlightenment that also reveals reality as it is, or is it a tool of deception projecting those images which can only fool a person? And how does it affect the viewers? How does it affect us, both cognitively and emotionally? Can we use cinema as a tool for the change of the society, or is it only copying and reproducing relations of power in the given contemporary societies? There are some fascinating questions which have continually been debated on by the film theorists. Many of them also happen to be filmmakers since the very inception of the cinema. And if we have to put a date to the inception of cinema as we understand it today, I would say that it begins in the last decade of the 19th century. The association of film or cinema with a literary text has always been a very complex issue. We can quote from Seymour Chapman, who says that from a text, a reader can learn only a limited number of details, and then the picture has to be filled up imaginatively. And here, in any reading of the text, it is the imagination and sensitivity of the reader which comes into that play. However, in the representation through the medium of film, the number of the details are not only indeterminate, but they are also presented. In fact, these details are often not asserted, but they are simply presented before the narrator. In its essential visual mode, the film, as Chapman says, does not describe at all, but merely presents, or better, it depicts, it renders in pictorial form. So, the basic difference between a film and literary text is based on the medium. The film uses the pictorial form, the images, and the literature uses words, and therefore we find that they are two different genres, so to say. The film history begins in 1895 with a private screening of a short film by Lumiere brothers, and it was followed by a more public screening in December of the same year, and this picture was known for the documentary realism. Lumiere brothers used cinema as a way to investigate reality and also to document history. Their attempts were followed by Georges Méliès, who was known for fantasy based movies, and he exploited films for entertainment and imaginative play. His films followed contemporary cultural traditions. That was a fascination with the spectacle under a clear impact of the theatre, and he also turned to literary materials for different kinds of subject matter. And here we are going to screen for about 30 seconds the first real motion picture by the Lumiere brothers. The title of this movie is Workers Leaving the Lumiere Factory in Lyon, produced in 1895. Since these documentaries, as Lumiere brothers had presented, and events which are already known to people, can entertain audience in a limited way, they have an air of reporting, of a newspaper reporting to them, and therefore for entertainment, films turned to the cultural currency of popular literary tales, and these tales were often based on action. For example, in 1896, we had Rip Van Winkle, 1900 Cinderella, 1902 Robinson Crusoe, also Gulliver's Travels, followed by Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1903, Damnation of Faust in 1904. And particularly if we look at this list, we find that Cinderella and Robinson Crusoe have been made and remade in various formats of media, not only as films but also as TV serials, as web serials, and in other popular mediums. The birth of cinema can also be traced with the first Nickelodeon explosion. The Nickelodeons were developed in 1905. It was a multi-purpose theatre which was very popular for about 10 to 14 years in the first decade of the 20th century. As the name suggests, nickel is a coin and the Odeon is a Greek word for a roofed over theatre. So these Nickelodeons or these theatres were established in America. The first Nickelodeon, the picture of which is presented over here, was opened in 1905 in Pittsburgh. For a small sum of 5 cents, a small storefront theatre show, people could visit them, and these were played to live musical accompaniment. The audience simply loved them because for the audience it was the first live experience of moving images. It was something which was drastically, revolutionarily different from their previous experiences. But the newspaper medium also started to denounce films as being morally objectionable. A very significantly popular movie was The Great Train Robbery, which was released in 1903. It was a short movie. So this movie changed the way of entertainment forever. It established films as a lucrative form of entertainment in the USA, and it was considered as the major first Western film introducing this particular genre of films also. This film was also based on a historical event, that was a robbery on a train by the gang of Butch Cassidy. It was a major narrative film which was also known for its technical and editing innovations. For the first time, we find that this movie introduced cross-cutting editing technique, and which became popular for the presentation of action in a summarized and in a in a way which was attractive to the audience. Due to the popularity of the Nickelodeons, we find that the production companies grew and flourished during the first decade of the 20th century. The possibilities of filmmaking were also improved, and with technological innovations, as we have seen in the previous module, films also became longer. From 1 minute, from one reel affair, they became a 15 minutes affair. For a 15-minute projection, people also needed a storyline, and therefore storytelling developed. It was not just a documentation of everyday life which could entertain people. They wanted a script, something had to be told, a story had to be told, and therefore in order to tell a story successfully, the techniques of editing were also developed. So it is around this time that by 1920s we find that various studios had already developed. We had MGM, Warner Brothers, William Fox, and these studios also began to take control of industry. Motion Picture Patents Company developed to protect corporate profits, fight piracy, protect copyrights, all of which ultimately resulted in limited directorial and artistic freedom. During the 1920s, we find that it was still the era of the silent film. The American prosperity after the First World War and before the Great Depression also drove people towards mass entertainment, and the films or the cinematography was the newest fashion which attracted them. During this period, we find that the USA became the leading producer of films in the whole world. Nickelodeons became movie palaces, and movie palaces opened up throughout the Los Angeles. The Hollywood as such had developed by this time, and a star system was not only established, but it also started to flourish independently. The foreign market was dominated by the German expressionists, particularly by the melodramatic movies which were made by the German movie makers. However, by and large, we find that this genre, this business rather, was dominated by the USA. These silent films were black and white. They did not have any dialogue or any sound recorded on the film, but they could use some inner titles to suggest transitions, etc. Often they were played to live musical accompaniment, and these movies also had exaggerated expressionistic acting, so that the absence of words could be made up by the gestures and postures of the people. In a way, we can say that it was a visual storytelling, a unique way in which cinema could communicate purely through visuals, slapstick, physical comedies, and therefore we find that the short movies by Charlie Chaplin became very popular. In 1926, there was an invention of Vitaphone which synchronized sound with film, and we find that Don Juan in 1926, that was the first film with synchronized soundtrack. However, it did not have any dialogue, but it had the soundtrack of music, and therefore the group of musicians was not required in the theaters when it was played. The first talkie, the first movie with the dialogue, was released in 1927. That was a jazz singer. That was the first talkie or the first musical, and the first words were, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet." It was mostly silent. It had 6 songs and barely 350 spoken words. It also won the first Academy Award in 1927. So we find that the silent era has ended now, and there is an upheaval. Now we find that in this era, while people were still enamored by the movie, there were certain restrictions which were being felt by those people who were in the business for making films. The camera movement was restricted because the sound equipment was very heavy, and acting also suffered because there was a compulsion to record live dialogue. The actors were inexperienced in using their voice for the record purposes, and the sound equipment was also stationary. So it put several restrictions on the capabilities of the actors to move around and to use their voice effectively. Also, those actors who were otherwise good looking but did not have a good voice also suffered, and the voice as well as the face became important, and therefore it resulted into a decreased marketability for some actors. And very soon we find that new equipments were developed for sound stages, soundproof cameras, and then we find that there was a market which became restricted for the English language films. In other countries, because the technology was not developed at the same pace, we find that the market was overpowered by the English movies. Whereas silence is universal, a particular language can be understood only by the native speakers, and therefore we find that the market was overcrowded by the English based films only. The classical cinema started to draw from literature around this time heavily, and particularly I would refer to the work of D.W. Griffith. His work after 1913 is credited for the birth of classical cinema from literature. When the movies started shifting from one reel shots which ran from 10 to 20 minutes to longer narratives of 90 to 100 minutes, there was a demand for a storyline. One reel shots competed for short stories which were available with popular publications, and therefore there were many writers who used to publish in the Saturday Evening Post. Their short stories were very much in demand because one short story could easily be filmed in a 1 or 2 reel shots. But for longer narratives, people needed longer stories, and therefore we find that Griffith started to turn towards the 19th century realistic novels, and particularly we find that the work of Dickens was very much in demand. It is interesting to note that in the beginning of the 20th century, the contemporary novel was moving towards being experimental. We have novelists like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce who were experimenting with the techniques in order to express the inner goings on of the characters, whereas the cinema, as it was still in the nascent stage, went towards the realistic novels for inspiration. Griffith borrowed from serial novels for one reel shots, particularly he borrowed from Perils of Pauline, also from poetry because he made one reel shots based on Whitman's Leaves of Grass. He also made one reel shot on Tennyson's Enoch Arden. His film version of Enoch Arden, based on Tennyson's poem, was later on developed into a more faithful version and into a 2-reel version. Many places showed the 2 reels as 2 independent parts, but Griffith always treated it as a single film. This version altered the direction of the cinema and its relationship with literature, which among other aspects had also introduced the star systems. So we find that this system of stars, with the sellability of a film, because of the presence of a particular individual in it, also dates back to the early decades of the 20th century. Now, it is at this moment that the criticism of the film versus the criticism of the novel was started by the people. It is already well established in the beginning of the 20th century that there are 2 independent yet interdependent art forms, and people tried to explore the essence of the cinema and provide conceptual frameworks for understanding film's relationship with literature in order to understand these 2 different forms of expression. If we come to the expression of an individual or individual sensitivity or the sensitivity of a people, then what are our expectations from any art form? For example, if we read a novel or a story, what exactly we want in it? When we watch a film, do we want anything in it? Or when we look at a TV serial which is based on literature, when we watch a movie which is based on literature, what are our expectations in it? Do we look at a movie only for the entertainment? Do we read a novel or a story only for the entertainment? or do we have certain other expectations? So we find that critics as well as filmmakers were struggling to find out answers to these questions. It is very pertinent to refer to certain critics who were writing in the early days of the development of movie. I would refer here to Bela Balzac, the pioneer in the sphere of film theory, who had written that the film is the only new art form which can afford the opportunity of studying the laws governing the evolution of an art in the making. As it is progressing day by day, it is still not an established art form. It also does not have any history to which it can fall back on, and therefore he finds it very interesting. He also recognizes the power of the films as being the greatest instrument of mass influence ever devised in the whole course of human cultural history. And he argues that a deeper understanding of the origins and developments of this new expression would offer a knowledge of the conditions of the evolution of culture in an industrial age. Now, here it is noteworthy that he is referring to the development or the evolution of culture in an industrial age, and therefore we also have to remember the close connections which cinema as an art form has with industry, with technology, and also with the market forces of the capitalist era. Balzac also laments the lack of critical appreciation of films as a major disservice to the mental health of the nations, as in his opinion films have a much greater impact and influence on the minds of the public than any other art form. He suggests therefore that the wholesale industrialization of art and literature did not start with the film, but in his opinions films arrived only when there was this trend already established, and this trend of industrialization and commercialization of art in a big way was gaining momentum. The invention of film cinematography was immediately grabbed and used for large scale exploitation of dramatic art, and the camera made it possible to substitute a machine made, one might say, industrial production of the actual flesh and blood handmade performance of the stage, and therefore it was turned into a commodity capable of being reproduced in unlimited quantities and distributed at low cost. So, we find that Balzac here has presented a very interesting argument. He says that cinema is the product of a world where the commercialization of art had already started. And since the commercialization of art had already started, cinema as a particular art form was captured by those people, and it was utilized particularly because the technology had made the larger reproduction and distribution easier. His scholarship on films recognizes the unique position of film as an art form whose origin and development is coextensive with the growth of industrialization. Film emerges, in his opinion, as a site that encapsulates the contradictions of the society and culture in a post-industrial and post-modern society. And critical appreciation of films affords us the ability to understand and explore the various impulses, drives, and ideological frameworks that dominate and direct one's perceptions of reality. The revolutionary potential which a film as an art form possesses is also highlighted by Walter Benjamin in his very interesting essay titled The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, published in 1936. So, we can see that when cinema as a medium of art form was developing, people were still grappling with the various dimensions it may have, and whether the mechanical reproduction of an art form is necessary for a culture or not. So, Benjamin argues that mechanical reproduction inaugurated a drastic change in the way people understood the conception and function of art. Prior to that, the conception and function of art was viewed in a different manner. He also says that the democratization of art forms, as they became available and accessible to a greater number of people, is at the very heart of the revolutionary potential of an art form like film that promotes, and I quote, the revolutionary criticism of traditional concepts of art. So, Benjamin has also viewed the cinema as a revolutionary criticism of traditional concepts of art and looks at its revolutionary potential in a positive manner. Benjamin has been influenced by the Soviet cinematic practices of montage as a dialectical category, and therefore he says that cinema as a medium has the ability to change the reaction of the masses towards art, fusing visual and emotional enjoyment with the orientation of the expert. It has the ability to provide the opportunity for collective experience and has the ability to enrich our field of perception through slow motion, different types of camera motions, distances, close ups, and enlargements. So, we find that Benjamin has also talked about the collective experiences, the emotional enjoyment fused with the visual appeal of the cinema. As opposed to this optimistic view, we find that Adorno has criticized the film industry in his essay on culture industry. He says that the film, the mode of participation which the film makes it possible for us or opens up for the people, it forces upon the spectator a mode of participation in which there is no possibility for having creative and imaginative powers. Adorno's idea is that the spectator simply looks at certain visuals, certain images, and he is not able to participate in any creative and imaginative way. He argues therefore that the sound film surpasses the theatre of illusion to such an extent that it leaves no possibility to respond critically to what is being shown without losing the thread of the story. His idea is that if a viewer does not want to lose the thread of the story, has to keep on looking at the screen, and while the spectator is so much engrossed in looking at the screen, he or she is not able to look at it critically. So, relentlessly the images move on, and therefore the spectator's power of observation is utilized only in watching these images, and the critical appreciation is not possible. However, Adorno's discussion of the film is limited to its production and functioning under monopoly capitalism. Outside that, perhaps it does not have much validity. While a lot of scholarship exists on adaptation studies that revolve around the adaptation of literature into film, we find that these debates often focus on the fidelity discourse and judge films on whether they have been successful in replicating the original intent and vision of the literary work, or whether these films have intervened to provide a perspective on the original. So, the fidelity criticism of the movie adapting a particular piece of literature is very popular, and I think it is the commonest way of looking at this relationship. Film and literature are often viewed as being related fields. Bluestone has asserted that the novel and film are overtly compatible but secretly hostile. They both share a narrative, a series of events or actions which unfold in a sequential manner or may be logically connected by virtue of their emplotment. What makes them different art forms is narration. The way of narration is very different. Both film and literature have to create a world, they have to represent or depict lives with a degree of verisimilitude and immediacy that cannot be achieved by any other art form. At the same time, we can say that both these literary forms and both these forms of expression depend on the capability of the reader or the spectator to use the perception as a code, the reading strategies in order to apprehend the intent of the writer, and at the same time to comprehend the connectivity of the images which are being presented before him. Whereas literature uses textual codes and depends on conventional linguistic codes, cultural ways to create and narrate complex narratives, film has created its own codes. It does have certain visual codes. For example, it can use costumes, decor, mise-en-scène, etc. It has also developed certain cinematic codes like montage, length of a shot, camera angle, and movement to animate their narration. It uses words also because the dialogue is important in any movie nowadays, but at the same time we find that it has also developed its parallel codes. The medium of the film, though it uses a repertoire of technical innovations and different cinematic codes, is limited still in its ability of representing the aspect of temporality as easily as a piece of literature. The duration of the medium of cinema is restricted. A film cannot fully, in detail, represent narratives that have developed over a long passage of time without taking help of certain special effects, conventions, and techniques. On the other hand, literature can really direct the reader in a step manner towards the progression in linear time. Despite some of these issues, we find that film has emerged as a narrative and visual art in its own right, and it has also influenced literary production even as it has borrowed from literary codes. In our discussions in the next module, we would see how films and literature influence each other. Normally, we understand that literature has been adopted by the films, but we find that film also has a deep impact on literature. Films also offer us the opportunity to unravel the discursive means through which power relations are organized in the service of a status quo. In the modern times, films reflects the mechanism of these power relations in the creation of vocabularies to understand identity and community in popular culture. Thus, the films are analogous to the literary texts that contain narratives of conflict between individual and society. So, now let us discuss what is unique about film as compared to other arts. To begin with, we can say that there are certain formal qualities, the techniques of filmmaking, genre, etc., which differentiate it from other arts. At the same time, it has a need for capital investment in comparison to any other art. Most of the arts are developed on the basis of the patronage system, and the need for capital investment was never as great as we find them in the movies. Even in the theatre, even in the best days, we find that it was never as costly as the making of a film was. It is a team effort unlike any other art form practiced earlier. At the same time, it also has a unique relation to the mass audience. Several aspects of it can be compared with the theatre performance, but we find that the differences are too significant to put them in the same category. Let's try to have a look briefly of the history of film theory. In the first phase, we find, which we can put somewhere around till mid 1930s, it was a silent period and it is known as formalist phase or a classical phase. We do have theorists like Hugo Munsterberg, Rudolf Arnhem, Sergei Eisenstein, who argued that film is an art and not just a direct recording of nature. We also have critics like Siegfried and Bazin, who say that film is not in contrast to nature but in an art of nature. Eisenstein has written in detail comparing the art form with the novels written by Dickens in the previous century. And I quote from him. He says, "What were the novels of Dickens for his contemporaries, for his readers? There is one answer. They bore the same relation to them that the films bear to the same strata in our lives." Eisenstein wants to suggest that the contemporary audience is as organically related to the medium of films as Dickens's readers were related to his novels. In the second phase, which is limited to the decade of 1960s and 70s, we find that the classical phase was being challenged by those writers and filmmakers who were responding to the historical conditions. The decade of 1960s has been a violent decade of the 20th century. The effects of Vietnam War were being felt in the American societies. There were riots in America and France also, and knowledge was constantly being redefined by literature and social sciences in the context of these disturbances. So, we find that the ways in which classical phase responds to art, nature, society, gender and language etc. was also being challenged in this second phase. It was followed by another phase in 1970s where, inspired from linguistics, people and filmmakers started to draw upon the works of Chomsky and Soso and started questioning the systems of meaning that allowed communication of all kind to exist. Various theories of Lacan, Derrida, Strauss, Foucault, Freud etc. were applied on film analysis. The fourth phase of the history of film theory is rather eclectic. So, we find that in this time the various aspects of human knowledge were applied to understand films, and approaches drew on feminism, cognitive psychology etc. in a much more significant way in comparison to what was being done in the third phase. They assert the shaping activity of the audience on film meaning and say that audience are not just passive as postulated in earlier approaches, but their response towards the films should also be taken into consideration. The resistance of the performer to the meaning imposed by film narrative was also discussed a lot. So, we find that these other challenges of digitization and new forms of media were also being felt in this eclectic period, and cinema as a visual medium of art was gearing up to accommodate and understand these changes. The visual channel can also be very easily understood on the basis of this diagram, which I have adopted from Seymour Chapman, and we can understand that different challenges which are faced in the visual channelization of our images have been presented in this tree diagram. Film theory and film criticism are two different words, two different terms, and they have to be understood in this perspective. Film theory is a way of looking at movies from a particular intellectual or ideological perspective. It is concerned with many areas of investigation. For example, the film text itself, the structural properties and meanings of the text, its connection to culture and history, the relationship between reality, film, as well as the anti-realism of films, the production of movies as a result of art, economics or technology, and the psychological reaction of the audience to the images projected on the screen. On the other hand, film criticism is generally focused on evaluating a film's artistic merit and appeal to the public. A film's meaning can also be different. It can be explicit, which is very direct as it is being presented on the surface, and at the same time it can also be an implicit meaning which is being narrated by the film as an association, connection or inference that a viewer makes on the basis of the explicit story and form depicted in the movie. So, what lies below the surface of the explicit meaning is the connotative meaning, the implicit meaning of a film. A film may also have an ideological meaning, a body of ideas expressed by a film that reflects beliefs on the part of the filmmakers, characters, etc., or the time and place of the settings of the movie. Ideological meaning is the product of socio-political, economic, religious, philosophical, psychological, or sexual forces that shape the perspectives of the filmmaker, not the film viewer but the filmmaker. So, an understanding of these different approaches helps us in understanding the movies in a better manner. So, when we look at these approaches, we find that there may be either semiotic. For example, what type of signs and sign processes have been used in the movie. Semiotic approaches include the study of signs and sign processes, indication, analogy, symbolism, etc., and it should not be confused with the Saussurean tradition which is called semiology. So, the semiotic approaches may be realist, which may be based on the representation of reality in a photographic manner, which may be true to life, or they may be formalist, using montage construction combining so that the meaning evolves from the juxtaposition of shots which show different types of moods or conflicts, etc. Or they may be rhetorical, persuasive, trying to pass on a message in a moral way, for example, war is bad, etc. Or mise en scène, in which a particular type of environment is created by lighting, set, movements, costumes, etc. So, the futuristic films can also be put into this category. Another approach is the structuralist one, where it can be a mythic one based on the myths, the traditional myths, the Greek myths, or even the contemporary myths. The feminist approaches, and as we have discussed feminism in detail, we will not repeat it here. The sociological approaches can also be there. The political approaches have also been very popular in the period movies. For example, the Marxist approach has been a very popular one, in which the proletariat is projected as a hero, rising up and creating a classless society with prosperity for all. And the Marxist vision of society is particularly portrayed in the movies of Devashenko and Pudovkin. The psychoanalytical movies have also become very popular, and they may reveal emotional dynamics which are not deliberately fashioned by the artist. So, for example, expression of sexual desire in art are intertwined with incompletely suppressed aggression, fear and guilt, and a critic can link an artwork and an artist's biographical background with an interpretation that reveals unconscious manifestations of desire, aggression, fear and guilt. So, there have been several movies with notable Freudian influences on them, including some movies by Ingmar Bergman, as well as some famous movies of Alfred Hitchcock, for example, Spellbound and Vertigo. In fact, Hitchcock's Psycho is considered to be a reading in the Freudian understanding of our psyche, including the discussions of ego and superego, presenting them through the characters, weaving them in the plots of and the themes of the movie. At the same time, there may be contextual approaches, and in the contextual approaches, we find that the auteur is the most popular one. It is based on the directorial style of a author. It postulates that the film director is the author of a movie. It has roots in the 1920s French cinema, and its popularity peaked there in the 1950s with an influential film journal which was founded and edited by Andre Bazin. A director also must have made a significant number of films to be considered an auteur. It helps us in identifying those directors whose work displays ideological and stylistic consistencies. There can be some other genres also, for example, westerns, war, horror, etc. There may be historical studies, cultural studies, period dramas, etc. So, we find that these type of approaches help us to view the cinema as a particular art form, detailing it in terms of its possible impact on the audience. We will continue this discussion from the perspective of the association of film with literature and to what extent these two genres have been mutually benefited by each other. Thank you.